Hi, in this video I want to have a look at how to get an Android app to log into a REST API. I've got the skeleton of an Android app which has a activity which displays a login screen where the user is asked for their email address and their password, and when they press the login button those details need to be sent to a REST API. When the response comes back, then we need to display a message on the screen to say whether or not the user has successfully logged in or not. We'll come back and have a look at the code for the application in a moment. First, I just want to demonstrate the way the REST API works. So I have my server running on localhost on port 8000. At the URL API login, I can send a post request where the body of the post request contains a JSON string with the email address and the password of the user we're trying to log in with. The request is sent with two headers specifying a content type and an accept of application JSON. When I send the request to the server, I get back a response which will include a token if we manage to log the user in correctly, and then that token can be used for authenticating this user on subsequent requests. So for example, if I copy this, I can now send a request to get some data. Let's say I want to get data from the database, a list of all the courses that are stored in the database. I need to send an authorization header. So I can say I want to send a bearer token, and then I can just paste in the token here. This effectively creates a third application header, and you can see that I get back an array with a whole load of objects in it, which are the details of all the various different courses that are available on the web server. In the request, the headers that are sent, you see a third header gets sent where I'll get the authorization as the key, and then bearer space and the token that I pasted in. So this is basically what we want to be able to do in our Android app. We want to be able to do that login and get back a token which we can then use to authorize the user for subsequent requests. So in the Android app, I'm going to use a few additional packages. So before we actually look at the code, I'm just going to have a look at the Gradle file, the build.gradle file for the module app rather than the project. And in here you can see that I'm including some additional packages. I'm going to use the layout constraint layout in the login form. I'm going to use some material design components in that form. I'm going to use a recycler view later on to display a list of courses or whatever that we're going to get back. And then we're going to use volley for sending and responding to HTTP requests. We're going to send HTTP requests and then handle the responses. In my manifest file, I've got a single activity, login activity, which is our main activity. It will be launched when the application is launched. I have set an attribute on the application saying that we want to be able to send clear text traffic. So we don't want to have to use HTTPS because this is just a little bit simpler. And I've also specified that my application needs permission to access the internet. The login activity file at the moment is very empty. It simply loads up the view activity underscore login and activity underscore login, uses constraint layout, and it contains three components at the top level: a text input layout for the email address, a text input layout for the password, and then a button which has the text login on it. If we look at these text input layouts, they basically wrap a label and an actual edit text, or in this case an autocomplete text view, which is like an edit text which will do autocomplete. If I show you this, what happens is that I've got a hint in here which is the email address. So this hint is coming from down here for Android hint email address. But if I click on this, the hint moves up and becomes a label, and then I can type in the email address of the person I want to log in as. So this is what this text input layout and the autocomplete text view, when you put these together, one nested inside the other, this is the effect that we get on the screen. I'm saying that I want my layout to take up the full width of the component, and I want its height, its width is to match its parent and its height is to just wrap its content. We're having 8 pixels margin, top, right, bottom and left, and we're constraining this component to start at the start and the end of the parent, in other words the left and right of the parent. So it's going to be the full width of the screen, and it's going to be constrained to the top of the parent screen and to the bottom of this component is constrained to the top of the password layout. And then the password layout, the top of the password layout is constrained to the bottom of the email layout, and then the bottom of the password layout is constrained to the top of the button. And then the top of the button is constrained to the bottom of the password layout, and then the bottom of the button is constrained to the bottom of the parent. So this basically lines up our components vertically, and we can see this here. So I got my email field, my password field and my button. This chain symbol here in the middle means that these are chained together vertically. This line here basically means that these are constrained to the top of the parent and the bottom of the parent. And then the other thing that I have is I have said that because these are in a chain, I've said that I want their chain style to be packed, which basically means that the items will be packed together in the center of the screen rather than spread out vertically. So this is how I get the visual look that I have on the screen. Now, at the moment when I click on the login button, nothing happens. So I need to change this to get a reference to the login button and the 2 edit text fields for the email address. So I'm just going to get these. So I can just go or.id and then reference them by the IDs that I've given them in the layout file. So now I've got reference to those 3 components, and what I need to do now is to set a on-click listener for my button. So I can say I can create an object here, or I could make my activity listen to the button. What I'm going to do, because it's simpler, is just to go new view on-click listener. So this is basically going to create a subclass of view.onClickListener, and that subclass is going to override the onClick method from this class here. So I'm effectively creating a subclass of this class, view.onClickListener. The code for that subclass is going to be in here. And then having made that subclass, I'm then going to create an instance of that class, and that instance will become the on-click listener for our button. This style is basically creating what's called an anonymous class in Java. It's a class where we create a class and then create an instance of it, and because I didn't give the class a name, I can't use that class again. I'm only ever going to use it to create this one object. So in here I know that the button has been clicked on, so what I need to do now is to get the email address So I want to get the text object from my email address and then convert that to a string, and that gives me a string. I need to do the same with the password. So now I should have the email address and the password from my form. And what I'm going to do here is just to test this, I'm going to make a toast. If I say this there, this is a reference to the object. The variable this will be a reference to the object that I'm creating. The object that I'm creating with the new operator here. So I can't use that to refer to the instance of login activity. So I need to go login activity dot this. So that's my context. And then what I want to display is just say the email address that I've retrieved. And then I'm going to have the password. And then how long do I want to display it for? I want to display it for a relatively long time. Then I'm just going to say show. So when I press the button, it should display the email address and password that we got from our form. And I'll just put a semicolon there. So if I save that, I'll stop my application running in the emulator and then I'll run it again. So if I type in an email address here, and go login, you can see down here it's showing me what it's read from the login form. There it is again. Okay, so I can see that I'm picking up this event listener and I'm able to read what's coming off the form. I can just get out of that. Now, I obviously don't want to just display that on the screen. I need to do something a bit more useful. So what I need to do now is I need to use this information to log into my REST API. So I'm going to use a model class to control all access to my data, which will be managed by my REST API. So I've got a skeleton model class over here. So as I've done in the past, I'm going to use the singleton design pattern to make sure there's only ever one instance of the model class. So I'm going to have a static variable instance, which will be an instance of the model class, and a get instance method, which checks to see if that's null. If it is, we create a new model object. Otherwise, we return the model object that we had before. When we create our model object, we're going to give it a reference to our application object. The application object is basically like a context object. There's one application object for the entire application. So the application can have 10 activities in it, but there'll only be one application object. And we can use that whenever we need to have a reference to a context. And you'll see why we need to use this later on. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to have a method that will allow me to log in. So I'm just going to create a method here, which will take an email address and a password. And then what am I going to do here? Well, I'll actually log into my REST API. Now, I could build this application so that in such a way that the code for accessing the REST API is put into my model class here. But then if I want to change my application, so I'm no longer using a REST API, I want to use some other form of login. Let's say I want to log into Firebase, or I want to log into using my Google account or something like that. Well, then I'm going to need to change the way this works. So instead of putting all the code into the model class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a subclass. What we're going to do is we're going to access the web server using Volley. So I've got a subclass that's in a package called, well, this class model is in a package called com.collegeenrollments.model, and then I've got a subclass of a subpackage of that called API. So this web API is basically going to be a class that's going to contain all the code for actually sending requests to their REST API. Okay, and this is in a package, a sub-package called comcollegeenrollments.model.api. This class has a static variable, which is our base URL for where our REST API is. It's got a request queue, which is where our volley requests will go. And what I need to do in here is basically implement a login method. I should have just copied the one that I had from the model class. I'll just type this up. So this needs to have the code that we're going to use to actually send the request. So in the model class, what I now need to do is then basically, well, call that method. So I need to create an instance of this web API class. So what I could do in the model class is just go web API equals new web API, and then this needs a reference to our application. And then that class needs to be imported. I misnamed it. Why can't it find this? Create class. I just put an import up here. Oh, I see. This isn't a public class. That's why I couldn't find it. So that fixes this. The trouble with doing it like this is that this variable then is always going to have to be a variable of type web API. And it means that, let's say I want to change from using my REST API into using a database server or using Firebase or something like that. It means I have to come in here and I need to edit the declaration of this variable. So this is where an interface is useful. So instead of making the variable API of type web API, what I can do is define it to be of type API, which is an interface. Okay. So when you have an interface, basically what you do is you define a whole load of methods. The methods are public by default because it doesn't make sense to have a private method in an interface. So in here, we're going to say any class that implements this interface needs to have a method called login, which takes a string email and a string password as a parameter. It's an interface, so we're not going to define an implementation for these methods. We're just going to say a class that implements this interface must implement this method. So over here now in web API, we can say, well, this class implements the API method, and there's its implementation of login. At the moment it's empty, but we need to put some code in there. So back in the model class, I can now import this. So I'm just going to copy and paste that and make that API. And now my variable API is a reference to this. Now, I need to use this variable API in a lot of different methods inside this class, so it actually makes sense if I initialize this variable inside the constructor for my model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this code out of here. I'm going to put it in here because I'm going to use this API variable quite a lot. So I'm going to make it a member variable, API. So put the M there as an abbreviation for a member variable or an instance member method or an instance method. And I'm going to go Alt Enter and say create a field, and I want it to be of type API. Okay, So now what this means that is that, let's say I decided I wanted to have a different implementation of my API. I wanted to get all the information from a database. So then I could just change this implementation from Web API to say DB API. And then I could just use this variable. I wouldn't have to change any other code if I wanted to change my implementation. Just change this one single line. Okay, so this just makes my code more flexible. So now when I call the login method on my model object, well, all my model object is going to do is call the login method on my API. So that's just delegating the role down to the API class. So my implementation of the API class is down here. So now this is where I have to decide, well, what am I going to do? Well, in here what I need to do is I need to send a request to the REST API. And if you go back to our login request, here it is here. The body of the request needed to have the email address and the password encoded as a JSON object. And then the response, I think, is gone, but we'll just send the request again. Get a new response, and then a response comes back as a JSON object. Okay, so I want to send a JSON request. I want to send a HTTP request to the server, and I know that what I'm going to get back is a JSON response. So inside the Volley library, there is a class called JSON object request. I'm just going to need to import this class. I've misspelled that somehow. JSON object request. There it is there. Now, this method takes a number of parameters. We just go and do a quick Google search and we will have a look at the various different parameters that are used by this method. So we're going to send a standard request. We're going to use a JSON object request. And the first parameter is the type of method that we want to send. The second parameter is the URL. The third parameter is a reference to the body content. The fourth parameter is a response listener object, which will be invoked on a successful response. And then the final object is an error listener, which will be invoked if there is an error. So what I need to do is just create these objects. So I'm just going to copy this code here. Into my Android application. So before I create the request object, I'm going to create the two listeners. So my success listener will be this object here. I need to import some of these classes. Get rid of these syntax errors. And then I don't want to do that. So that's basically creating an instance of the response listener class where it's going to take a JSON object as a parameter. So we're creating an instance of that class, but we're actually creating a subclass of it, because we're going to override the onResponse method. Now, as well as doing that, we need to create our error listener object, which is this code here. So I'm just going to copy that code, paste this in. to import the volley error class. So this will be the object that I'm going to use as an error listener for listening for errors. And I'm just going to get rid of this comment. So for the moment what I'll do is I will put out a toast here. And I need a reference to my the context. So my Web API, when it's called, it gets a reference to an application context. So what I really need to do here is store that so I can use it later on. So I'm going to create a variable called mApplication, which will store a reference to the application object we receive in our constructor. And then I just need to create that as a field. Keep my instance variables separate to my class variables. So then down here I can then go mApplication as my context. The string I want to output was successful response. I will output that as a toast with long duration. And then here I'll put in error response. So now I've got my success listener, I've got my error listener. So down here I can now say, okay, well what I need to do is I want to send a post request. So I want to go request.method.post. I need to import the request class from volley. Then I need to give it the URL, which I'll create in a moment. Then I need to give it the request body, which I'll create in a moment. And then I need to specify my success listener and my error listener. So I need to create the URL. Well, the URL I'm going to send the request to is just a string, which will be our base URL plus the string API /login. And then the body of the request is going to be a JSON object. It's a JSON object. And let me just look at the documentation. It's either a JSON object or it's a string. Let's assume it's a JSON object because we need to create one of those first anyway. And then I need to put some properties into this object. I'm going to put in a property email, which will have the value of our email parameter. And then I'm going to put in our password. Now you'll notice that these are giving me errors because the JSON object.put method can generate an exception, so I need to put this code inside a try and a catch. So Android Studio just generates this code, and I'm just going to space it out the way I think it should be spaced out. I'm going to put this code in here, and then I'm going to take all this other code and put that inside the try and catch as well. So basically, if I get a JSON exception while I'm trying to do all this, I'm just going to print a message. I don't really want to do that. I'll come back to what I do there. Okay, we'll handle that exception later on. what we'll do is we'll just output a toast for the moment. And our message can say JSON exception. So we'll know what caused it. So now I have this JSON object, and down here I can create my body. I'll declare the variable here, and then I'll give it a value here. In fact, can I use my JSON object as a parameter? Yeah, so I can just use the JSON object as a parameter. I don't need to convert it to a string. So that's basically how I'm going to send my request. I'm saying, okay, create a request. Okay, it's a post request. Here's the URL I want to send the post to. Here's the body of the response as a JSON object. Here's an object that contains a method to be executed when a successful response comes back. Here's an object with a method to be executed if an error comes back. And then the last thing I need to do is to add this to our request queue. So the request queue gets created when the web API object is initialized. So then down here I can just go request queue dot add a request. When the request is added to the request queue, it will be processed on a background thread within the volley library. And when the response comes back, that background thread will create an event which will cause the success listener method on response or the error listener method on error response. It will cause one of those two methods to be executed, but that method will be executed on the main thread or on the user interface thread. So if I just save all that code now and stop my application and run it again. And if I type in my email address and password, I'll type in the correct ones first, go log in. I'm not getting a response here, so I've done something wrong. So I'm just going to debug this code. I'm going to stop this from executing. Going to check maybe back in login activity. There we go. Back in login activity, I got my email address and password, but I never actually called the login method on the model object. So the first thing I need to do here is get a reference to my model object. So I'm using the get instance method. This wants a reference to the login activity application object. So I can just go get application. So every activity has a method called get application, which gives you a reference to the application object, which represents our application. And then I can just go model.login, email, and password. So if I run this again, hopefully I should see a response this time. And now you can see it's telling me successful response. So I've logged in successfully. If I change this, change the password, make a mistake in the password, and go login, it now tells me it got an error response. So I haven't logged in properly. So now I can see that my code, my username and password are going over to the web server, and it's either telling me I've got the right username or password or not. Okay. So what I really need to happen now is when the response comes back, if you remember, we get this token back when we log in successfully. So I now need to store this token somewhere where I can use it again. So in my code, I have in the model package a class called user. Okay, now this class is fairly straightforward. It's got a couple of static methods which static method up here which I'll come back to. The user class basically has an email, a name, email and token as strings. It's got a constructor where I can create our user object from those. I've got get and set methods for each of those, and then I've got an equals method which allows me to check to see if one object is equal to another. So if the object I'm comparing this object to is not equal to null, and if it's an instance of user, I cast my reference into an object of type user, and then I check to see if the two objects have the same email address. And if they do, I'm going to say the result is true. Otherwise, I'll assume that the result stays at false. And then I've got a method to print the user out as a string, which simply prints the user's name and their email address in brackets. Up here I've got a method called getUser, which takes a JSON object and it will read that JSON object and give me back a user object. How does this work? Well, I simply ask the JSON object to give me the value of the attribute name, email and token that are stored within the JSON object, and then I use those to make a user object, and then I return that user object. If there's a problem getting these values from the JSON object, an exception is thrown by this method. So back in my web.api class, I can now use this code, because the response I get back here on successful response, what did I do there? I didn't mean to do that. The response that I get here is a JSON object. So I can simply say, can I have the, I can use that user dot get JSON method to extract a user object from that JSON response. So I can go user is equal to, and I need to import this class, so just go Alt Enter, import the class, user equals user, so it's a static method dot get user from my JSON object which is in my response. Now this can throw a JSON exception if something goes wrong, so this code needs to be surrounded in a try and a catch. So there's the code for the try and the catch. Just lay it out slightly differently. So if everything goes okay, I'm going to get my user object, and then I'm going to just have a toast to say successful response. In fact, what I'll do in here is I'll just go user I'll output the user's name, the user has logged in. So I'll just show that I've successfully created a user object, and if something goes wrong when I'm trying to parse that user object, I'll just output a string saying there was a JSON exception. That shouldn't happen. So if I stop my application and run it again, type in my email address and password, press the login button, and it comes up saying user Sam Blogs logged in. So you can see that it's created my user object correctly. Now what I need to do is I need to store that user object somewhere. So if I go back to my model class, I can store my user object in here because it makes sense to put it in here, because this is where I'm going to, the model class is basically where I save all my data. So part of my data now is who I'm logged in as. So I can create a private variable here of type user. I'll call it muser, and then I can create a get and set method for this. So if I right click on the name of the variable and go refactor, encapsulate fields, and I wanted to generate a method called getUser and setUser, you notice that because my variable is called muser, it's going to create a variable called get user. I want to just change that so it's just get user. I want to do the same with the set. Just take the out of that. And just go refactor. That gives me two methods called get user and set user. I'll just change that to user instead of user. Being a bit pedantic, it doesn't make any difference, but it just keeps the code neater. So in here now, back in my web API class, I can then take that user object that I've got and I can store that in my model. So I can go model is equal to model dot get instance, and it needs a reference to my application, application, and then I can just go model dot set user and the user object I've just created. And in fact, because we'll probably use our model object in more than one place, what I will do is I'll move that more than one method, I'll move that up to my constructor. I'll make this an instance variable, model. And then down here I can just say model. I'm going to have more than one method inside this web API class, so and they'll all probably need access to model, so that's why I'm making an instance variable out of it, so I can use it in subsequent methods that I write in this class. So there's our code. Our model object is now being saved. Now the only thing that I really need to do now is that the code for what I do next, I'd really like that to be put somewhere else. So when our user logs in, what I'm seeing here is this toast method, but what I'd really like to do is have that code up here in my login method, so that, because what this does is this tries to log in, and I don't know, I have to find out what happens next, I'd have to go down into the web API class, and that doesn't make sense. So what I'd like to be able to do is to restructure this code in some way so that after this request was sent, when the response comes back, I can see here the code that actually determines what actually happens when that response comes back. So how am I going to do that? Well, what I can do is I can restructure my code to use effectively like an event listener. Okay, so to facilitate this, I've written an interface called API listener, and in here I'm going to put in a method which will return no result, void, and it's going to be called on login, and it's going to take a user object as a parameter, and I will need to import the user object. Okay, so that's just an interface, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class that implements this interface. But so I'm going to make a new class in here, new Java class. I'm going to call it abstract, and I'll explain why in a moment. API listener, and it's going to implement the interface API listener. And then because it says it implements that interface, it needs to implement the methods of that interface. So there's our onLogin method. Now, what I would like to do is make this method basically don't do anything. I'm just going to leave it blank so it doesn't do anything. I don't want to put the code for what happens when I log in into this class. I want to put it in somewhere else. What I really want to do is I want to put it in here into my login activity. But how would I do that? Well, what I can do is, in login activity, I can pass in another parameter, which is my a reference to my listener object. Let's do it from the far end. Let's do it from down here. Let's say that the login method in my web API, it takes in an extra parameter, which is an object that implements the API listener interface. Okay, and when we get our response, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the onLogin method on this listener object, passing the user object that we've retrieved in as a parameter. Okay, so now when I call this login method, this takes a variable, a third variable, which is an instance of the class API listener, or an instance of it's a class that implements the interface API listener. So now I need to go back to my model method and say, well, when I call this, I need to give it a reference to a listener object. Well, where does that come from? Well, I'm going to give this that parameter as well. So when I call the login method on the model object, I'm going to need to pass in a listener object as well. So I'm going to go listener. This doesn't need to be final. Now, the reason I'm having a problem here is because this method is defined in the interface API. So now also need to go into the interface API, and I need to add in that extra parameter here. Doesn't need to be final. So this code is okay. So when I call the login method, I'm going to say email address, password, and here's the listener object to be notified when the response comes back. We notify the listener object by calling the onLogin method. So in the model class simply takes in that listener object as a parameter and passes it down into the API class. So now in my login activity, well, I now need to pass in a new listener object. So I need to create a new listener object here. So I can go new abstract listener, abstract API listener. So I'm going to create an instance of my API listener class, but I'm going to then create a subclass of that. And in here I'm going to override the blank onLogin method that's retrieved from that's defined in the abstract API listener interface. So now I can put the code in that I want executed when the response comes back. So in here I can go, I can get a reference to my model object. I had this before. I think I've cut it out of this method. I did, so I need to type it again. So I need to go model equals model dot get instance. I need to pass it in a reference to my application object, which is, sorry, I have a reference to my model object up here. I don't need to create it again. So then here I can just go model dot set user. The model variable will need to be declared as final, so that its value can't change between the time this is called and the time that this is called. And then maybe I'm going to put out my toast, just saying who has logged in. So now when I read this code for my login activity, it makes more sense, because you can see it kind of says, okay, when we click on this button, call the onClick method. And the onClick method basically says, call the login method on our model object, and when you get a response back, execute this method here. This method is going to just store our user object in our model and then put up a toast. Now, what we really need to do is go to another activity, but we leave that for another time. So I just save all this code, stop my application, run it one more time. And this should all work, hopefully. If I go login, I've missed something. So my application has crashed, has it? No, you just don't see the terminate button up here. Let's debug it this time. And what I will do is I'll put a breakpoint in here on the onClick method and a breakpoint in here in the onLogin method. So you can see that I've caught the event listener for clicking on the button. So I'm going to step over that line of code, step over that line of code. I can see that I've read my email address and my password successfully. So now I'm going to execute the line of code to get a reference to my model object. And that seems to have caused a problem. Run. Application terminated, large object allocation. So I'm doing something funny here. What have I done in my model? I'm creating my web API object, my web API object. It's getting an instance of my model object, which is causing an infinite loop. So I need to get rid of that line of code. I don't need the model object, I think, down here in this. So that's why my application crashed. I'm just going to terminate this. It's waiting for the debugger. And just run it again. sam@blogs.com. Secret is the password. I think I typed an extra character there. Log in, and it says Sam Blogs is now logged in. That line of code is coming from my login activity, which is here. So that's basically how we get it to log in. The login request comes from my login activity, and then the response is handled in my login activity. I don't have to bury the handling of the response down in the web API module. I can handle it here by using this listener object. Okay, we'll stop there.